Welcome to Morning Call, a podcast where we share our experiences around letting go of grief and learn to move with grace through mourning. We are your hosts, Alyce Christina
and Crystal Lee, two friends who connected through yoga and movement and ultimately found a deeper connection over our own parental losses.
We share how our experiences have informed us to live our lives more authentically, boldly, and in the now so that you can do the same. We believe where there is pain, there is transformation.
From the loss of a loved one to change in a career, a heartbreak, identity shift, and many other forms of loss, we walk this path together.
To discover the light within the darkness, we recognize the joy within pain and invite you to dive in with us as we share in the hope, laughter, and lightness of the mourning journey.
Join us for stories, interviews, and conversations that connect us as we explore the universal experience of loss that invokes the becoming of one's true self.
Welcome back to the Morning Call podcast. I'm your co-host, Crystal.
And I'm your co-host, Alyce.
And today we have a very special episode with a very special guest. We have hospice nurse Penny on with us today. Penny Smith, BSN RN, is a nationally certified hospice and palliative care nurse, social media influencer, and author of Influencing Death, Reframing Dying for Better Living. For 20 years, Penny has worked in a variety of care settings and roles within hospice, including inpatient, home hospice case management, education, quality, and regulatory. She currently works as a hospice quality assurance nurse for an organization in Washington State. Penny is a passionate advocate for hospice education with a mission to normalize the end-of-life process to remove the stigma and fear around hospice care, death, and dying. During the pandemic, she found her way to social media and discovered a unique way to utilize her death care expertise to provide education to a worldwide audience at a grassroots level. Using a variety of teaching styles, including TikTok trends, dark humor, my fave, dancing, and storytelling, Penny has gathered over 2 million followers across her social media platforms as Hospice Nurse Penny. Welcome, welcome. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. Anything else you want to add about your personal self life? I don't know.
No, I think that's pretty good.
Great. Awesome.
That sums it up.
You've summarized it beautifully.
Yes.
Highly recommend. You have a book coming out soon called Influencing Death, which we'll dive into and talk about.
I was going to say maybe first I think a lot of our listeners probably know about hospice and palliative care, but maybe define them for maybe those that don't know.
Sure. So palliative care is able to be, I can't think of the word, accessed at the same time a person is getting treatment for their disease. And it's for people who have a terminal illness with any life expectancy or a life-limiting disease that doesn't necessarily have to be terminal. And it's focused on symptom management, whole person care, usually takes place in the hospital or in a clinic. Hospice happens when there are no more curative options available or when the person decides not to pursue treatment anymore. So they can't have treatment for their disease. They have to have a terminal condition with a life expectancy of 6 months or less. And hospice takes place in their home or wherever they call home. There are a lot more team members involved in hospice. It's the same symptom management, whole person care, very focused on end of life. So you're going to have a bigger team that's going to be caring for that person when they're on hospice. Some people think of palliative care as like a stepping stone to hospice. It can be, it's not necessarily though, because again, people don't have to be dying to be on palliative care, and they do have to be dying to be on hospice.
Do you find, just as you were talking, do you find that people know about palliative care as an option as much as they do hospice?
Well, no, not really. And they don't know the difference. And palliative care is not as widely available as hospice. Hospice is available, in more areas. Palliative care is not. And people really don't know the difference. And I get lots of comments on my social media asking me, what is the difference between palliative care and hospice? In some countries, it's the same thing. In Canada, palliative care is hospice. But for us, it's two different types of healthcare programs.
I want to jump right into the book. One, we have just loved reading it. One of the things we talk about on this podcast quite a bit is sort of the sanctity around death. Like I thought so many people are afraid of it and they think it's fearful, and it can be if there's trauma and stuff, but um really we believe that it can be beautiful and sacred. And right out the gate, I think it's in the prologue, you say you talk about the sanctity, like the sacredness of it, and you say a quote around witnessing this beautiful sacred ending of one journey and the beginning of the next. And I just love that. So can you maybe just share more about your thoughts? And you speak to this in the book, obviously, but more on your thoughts around that sacredness.
Yeah. Well, people always think that death is this horrible thing that we shouldn't be talking about, and it's sad, and we want to just like shove it in the corner and not talk about it. And really, the best way to have a beautiful, sacred experience is to be able to acknowledge that it's actually happening. So I say that death is sad. It's always going to be sad, but it can be beautiful if we will be able to have conversations with the person who's dying, acknowledge that this is the journey that they're on. We are able to say what we want to say to them before they die. Those who are living have no regrets. They get to say goodbye. The person who's dying gets to process with the people who they love that this part of their journey is ending. So it's very sacred. Those are conversations that are literally once in a lifetime. And so many people miss the opportunity to have those conversations because they just simply do not want to acknowledge the elephant in the room.
Yeah, and that speaks to, I know, your passion around educating people around like the biological dying process, of course, right? But educating about what you just talked about, like we need to have these conversations. And like, I know, Alyce, you have some kind of anecdotes around, like for like your bath example. I don't know if you want to share. I know you wanted to talk to Penny about the education piece.
You talk in the chapter, Not Without My Daughters, right, about guiding the daughters of a patient to give their mother a final bath. And my experience, my mom was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and died 2 weeks later. So my experience with hospice was very like they came, they assessed. In reading your book, it's been very enlightening to hear like your experiences and how hands-on. And I think that the elephant in the room for us was like we just didn't know how quickly it was going. No one knew how quickly it was going to happen. And so I became like my sister was the logical person in the room, like wanting to give the medicine, where I knew like mom did not like medicine and she would spit it out, in her final days. And I was like, just, and have done a lot of reflection about what that meant, or like, was she really in pain, or was the medicine there to soothe us, as opposed, in the process, like physical process of her body giving out. And I helped her bathe for the last time. I made the decision, that was like the last time I helped her to the bathroom, that I could no longer do that because I didn't want to drop my mother, right? I could not let that be the last living memory of hurting her or hurting myself, even by, just taking that on and being like, okay. And she rallied several times in over a 4-day period. Yeah. And just not realizing in the moment how sacred that moment was for me to be able to care for my mother in that way. And it wasn't until really that I was reading that experience you had that I remembered that I had done that. Because it just felt like instinct to me personally.
Yeah, it reminds
And
me of, go ahead.
no, just how beautiful that moment was. I started crying while I was reading it. I mean, there were many parts where it's like, there was this visceral remembering of my own experience.
Yeah, and Alyce talks about like the rally and you talk about the death rattle or like the hazy gaze. And when my story is my dad died very suddenly while I was out of the country. I did not get to be with him. I did not get to see him. And but then when my grandmother died, I was able to be with her. And I had already been following you and Hospice Nurse Julie, and she got that hazy gaze, and I was so grateful to you, Penny. Like that it didn't scare me. It didn't, she had a little bit of a death rattle, and I was like, I know what to expect. And I was able to also educate people in the room. So can you speak to a few, it doesn't, I know there's so many like biological things, or even, you give the example of like the young man whose mom was playing like classical music, and you were like, does he like classical? So maybe tell us a few of those like anecdotes where you've been able to educate.
Well, one thing is, as far as the classical music goes, is realizing that a person who's dying is still going to enjoy the same types of things that they appreciated while they were living. And so often people want to fill the room with harp music and candlelight and darkness and, make it all peaceful and heavenly like or whatever, and not really understanding that that person is still who they were. Barbara Carnes talks about, I love the way that Barbara Carnes talks about the dying process, because what she says is we're born and then we die, and everything in between is life. It's living. So even when you're going through a dying process, you're still alive, you're still living. So you're still experiencing these things, and you are likely going to want the same type of atmosphere that you had any other time. And in that case, that was a young man who would rather listen to rap music than, and funny enough, so and as soon as you started talking, Alyce, about my patient who I helped the daughters bathe, I just instantly, and this was a long time ago, it was probably 15 years ago. Well, not 15 years ago. It was probably maybe 12 or 13 years ago that happened. But still, like when you mention it, I'm just like, ugh, I get a little verklempt, because that was really probably the most beautiful experience I ever got to take part in, caring for a dying person. But, the when sometimes you get to this place where you're doing and you're not thinking until later. And that's why I talk about sometimes it's important not to do, it's important just to be. But you're going through this activity that you're doing because you want to do this, and you're like you say, it's instinct. You're not really thinking about that this is the last time you're going to be bathing your mother, until later, and you look back and you're like, wow, that really was a sacred moment. So sometimes these moments that are sacred we don't even recognize until after they happen. But what I wanted to say about that patient was that the social worker and I got there one day, and there was some music playing on the radio. I think it was classical music. And the social worker said, I just wonder if she would like that kind of music, because we're close in age, and I can't imagine that she would like this music. And her parents were like, no, she loves that music. That's the station she always has it on. So, it's important not to assume things about people. That's another thing, you can't assume things. I've walked into a room where there was a lot of people around, and they're yelling and screaming at the football game, and the woman is in the bed actively dying, and I take one aside, and is this okay? Like, oh yeah, she always hosted parties every Sunday. She would love this. This is great. And then there are other times, and I think I tell the story in my book. I don't know if you've gotten to that chapter yet. Pretty sure I talk about my patient who, his daughters, two daughters, and his wife, when I told them he was going to be dying any minute, they were all of a sudden at the bedside stroking his hand over and over and saying, it's okay, you can go. And he just would not die until finally I went back in later, and I was like, would he like this? Would he be okay with this? And they were like, oh no, and instantly left the room. And then he died just like that after that. So we can kind of keep people here too sometimes by doing things that are not pleasant to them.
Yeah.
Do you find that I just think that's so beautiful that you are able to guide the families and like nudge them in a way like, hey, do you find that you're, well received? I'm sure there's like times where people maybe don't like that, but generally the families are like, oh, like they're grateful that you've helped them think about
Yeah,
things.
generally speaking, people are. Yes. Yeah. I mean, you always have people that are stressed out and in crisis, and they're not going to appreciate anything you say to them, but for the most part, people do, they do like that guidance, and they also appreciate when I'm very direct. And I've said, like, another example in my book story that I have about how we don't tell people about the truth about the fact that they're dying. And I had the young woman who came to the care center, and she was 28 years old, and she was put on hospice, but the oncologist told her she had a year left. And so when I told her that, as I was packaging her medications up for her to go home, and she was so upset because there were so many more medications. And I said, well, the doctor thinks that you have weeks to months left. She freaked out because the doctor told her that she had a year. So that was really unfortunate. I felt terrible. But then on the other hand, I had another patient who came over from the hospital, and he'd been there for a long time. His wife was like, what is going on? And I said, has anybody told you how long he has to live? And she said, no. And I really want to know. And I said, don't leave. I think he's going to die soon. And he did. So most of the time, people like the directness. They like to be, and you have to gauge that. It depends on when they're coming on. For Alyce, for example, your mom coming on and dying 2 weeks later, that's tragic. That is so sad to me that she was only able to be on hospice for 2 weeks. Somebody fucking dropped the ball on that one. And I don't know if she was having.
It was like 4 days, if
Oh, I thought
that.
it was two. Where did I get 2 weeks?
Well, her diagnosis, yeah.
Oh,
I
from
mean,
diagnosis to death was 2 weeks. Oh,
yeah.
yeah. That sometimes cannot be avoided. Although, if she got that diagnosis in 2 weeks and then she still only made it to hospice for 4 days, there's a period of time there when, I don't know, maybe they were trying to figure things out and they weren't sure. But definitely, oncologists are not always straight with people about their prognosis.
Well, and it was just, I remember the day distinctly because she was experiencing a lot of swelling, which I learned is, in my head, you have a medical term for it. I can't remember. It's
Edema,
edema,
unless it
yeah.
was in her
And
belly, and that would be ascites.
yes, yes, it was in her belly. And so we had taken her to try to go get the fluid drained. And they were like, they wound up not. I remember dropping my dad. It was 2020, so the height of COVID. Um, and so I dropped my dad and her off at the hospital. I like went to a vitamin store to get alkaline water because I was like trying to think of every holistic solution in the book that I could offer to her. And I got a call 20 minutes later and I knew they hadn't done anything or they couldn't do anything. And so I got them home. I sat at the kitchen island. We ate a bowl of sherbet together because that's all she wanted to eat. And she sat in her chair. I called my sister. I remember her saying, I don't understand what's happening. And so kind of like went through what the doctors had said, and they didn't drain anything because it was basically her organs shutting down. At least that was my understanding, or like the only thing I really could understand. Um, I called my sister and I was like, you got to bring the kids over. Like this is not normal. Like whatever's happening, I don't know what really is happening, but I think the kids need to see mom. And so she was sitting in her chair, all the kids were around, and I remember I was kind of behind her and she looked at Eliza, her oldest grandchild, and she said, I think it's time Mimi goes to bed. And so it was just like another, again, in reading the stories you've shared, it's like she knew something. I heard it, and then I was like, she's never asked in her entire lifetime to go to bed, and then my dad got upset with me because he was like, do you know something I don't know, and or that we don't know? And I was just like, it was the elephant in the room. It was saying that she was dying. No one had
She knew.
said,
Yeah, people
right?
know when they're
She
dying.
knew like something, again, it was like instinctual of like, this is it. And again, like she rallied, we got her in bed. I gave her a bath, like, and this was over again over a 4-day period. She kept trying to get up at like by day 3. by the end, I had a nurse friend come and give her a lymphatic massage, and she taught me how to do that, right, to move like the energy of the fluid in her body. And those were moments where she became very lucid and more conscious, which was amazing to see. And it's she did say, she was like, I'm not usually one that likes to be touched, but I knew, or like touched like in a massage way. She was like, and if I knew that it could feel like this, I would have gotten more in my lifetime. And I
Oh,
was just like,
that's
and
her
that was
deathbed
so,
regret that she didn't get more massages.
yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah. And I was just like, oh, mom. And, continued to do that for her. And yeah, it was just, all of those, um, I think it's just like releasing the stigma, like on what death is, and to have these conversations while we're cognitive, like while we're truly living. And I like, it's made me want to have these conversations with my 12-year-old now of like, if something happens to mommy, like, here's what I want. Like, I don't want you to be left in question of what I would want. I want it all. It's my death plan. Here it is.
I started doing that with my kids when they were young because so my daughters were, let's see, I've been a hospice nurse for almost 20 years, and my oldest daughter is 31. So she was 11. My other daughter was 9 when I started telling them songs that would come on the radio that I want to be played while I'm dying someday if I'm on hospice and I'm dying. So yeah. And kids as young as 4 years old can understand the concept of death loosely. So we should be explaining it to them.
Absolutely. And I know she just looked at me yesterday and was like, I want you to play Weezer if I die.
I
And
love that she loves
she
Lisa.
was like, I need you to have a party for me. I'm like, hey, that's my death
You're like, you
plan,
can't steal
not the
mine.
Weezer part. I'm like, okay, I got you, girl.
That's awesome. That is so awesome that you're having those conversations because that is the best way to help alleviate any kind of fear that she may have in the future about death. And so many people do. So many people have a lot of death anxiety, and it's a vicious cycle because we have it because we don't want to talk about it, and then we get this death anxiety, which creates this fear around it, and then so we don't want to talk about it because it makes us afraid, and it's a cycle, that we don't talk about it.
Which I always find so interesting because I'm like, it's the only thing in life that we're all going to experience. Like, I mean, birth, and then I guess taxes, you could say, but like
Well,
we're
not even
literally
everybody
all,
has to pay taxes,
that's
so
true. And people evade them all the time. So
yes,
it's like,
exactly.
so it's like, it's just, I find it so ironic that it's like the one thing people are so afraid of. And you mentioned that in the book, you say like the D word, because people, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying someone passed or whatever, but there's so many euphemisms, and you're like, just say death, just say, and like Elise's mom, like you say, so many people know when they're gonna die. Can you talk to that, your experience with that?
Yeah, well, I have to quote Barbara Carnes again, that she says, we live in our bodies, we know when we're dying. If you think about any time you've ever been sick, you know when you're sick. People know when they're dying, and sometimes they maybe don't want to say it out loud or they're not admitting it to themselves, but people know when they're dying, and they often will say, I need to go, I need to get out of here, I need to go take a nap, I need to pack my things, I need to go on a trip, I need to go home. Very, very common for people to say that and then to die shortly after, or within a week or two. One patient that we had at the care center kept saying he was driving the truck. I'm driving the truck. He was a truck driver. And the night shift said all night long, he kept going, I'm driving the truck, I'm driving the truck. And during the night, other patients were dying. And then in the morning, he died. And the night shift nurses were like, he was picking everybody up. And then in the end, he died too.
Wow.
I love that though. That's a beautiful story. That's
I know.
Can
amazing.
you
I
talk
love
about a
that. It's
little
incredible.
about like your experience with death anxiety and share a little bit more around that? I know, yeah, and talking about Amelia, like after her grandmother passed, and then she lost her grandfather on her dad's side, and she would come to me and be like, well, are you gonna die too? Right. And I was like, oh, like in my head, my mom would live forever. Right. Like, and so it was very, I was like, I can't guarantee that. I can't sit here and lie to you and tell you that. I'm like, no. So I started like reframing how I like, yes, you're right. We're all going to die.
Yeah,
And
we're all going to die someday, hopefully. Hopefully, it'll be
exactly.
years down the road.
And, just like I witnessed in her kind of like this fear of death and this anxiety that would build up in her. And just, your experience with that and how hospice has and working for hospice has um, alleviated or taken the weight off of it.
So my first experience with death was when I was about 9 years old and my grandfather died, and I wasn't close to my grandparents. My grandparents on my dad's side lived in Texas. My grandparents on my mom's side lived in Canada, in Manitoba, and we lived in Washington, mostly in California, because my dad was in the military. So I wasn't really close to any of my grandparents, and I did not know him very well. I had met him one time. He died when I was 9, and my mom used that to explain death to us as you go to sleep and you never wake up. And so that was terrifying to me, to think that I might go to sleep and I'm going to die while I'm asleep. Also, coupled with that is a lack of a religious upbringing. Thankfully, I wasn't indoctrinated by my parents, who were probably agnostic or atheist, I think. I don't even know, because we never discussed it. There was no religion in my life other than what I sought out, and it wasn't for me. So I had no concept of afterlife. So I have both. I have this fear of going to sleep and never waking up, and what happens after we die. What if it's nothing? And when I got to be in my 30s, I really started to have death anxiety. I worried all the time. I cried at night to my then husband, like, what happens if there's nothing after we die? And he'd say, well, it won't matter because you won't know, because there's nothing. That was not helpful to me. So when I decided to become a nurse, there's many layers to why I decided to be a hospice nurse, but one of the driving factors was that I had no experience with death other than about a year prior to my going to nursing school. And by the way, I was 40 when I went to nursing school, so you're never too old. My stepmother-in-law died on hospice, and that was the first experience I had knowing somebody like pretty well. Well, my cousin killed herself. That was different, but like seeing somebody go on hospice, and I never saw her at the very end. So I didn't see the dying process. I didn't see her after she died, but I met the hospice nurses. She was in a facility, and then she went home, then she went back to the facility. And I was just like, oh, these nurses are so amazing. They're just so smart, and they're so compassionate and caring, and wow, it's just, this is really awesome. And so that part that part of the onion layer was a factor, but also just my morbid curiosity around death and dying. Like, my death anxiety drove me to the point of, maybe I need to learn more about this thing we call death. And then going into hospice, there were things that at first I used to say, well, it's because I started seeing people having deathbed visions. They're talking about people that they see in the room with them. Clearly, like, this is not drugs. This is not brain tumor. This is people who are lucid, and they're weeks before their death, and they can communicate. My wife is over here in the corner of the room, and pets too. So started to kind of form this belief in an afterlife. Like, when you see somebody having deathbed visions, you cannot dispute that what they see is what they say, or what they say they're seeing is what they're actually seeing. It's just uncanny to see somebody. They're very convincing. There's someone in the room. And so I started to kind of form this um, belief in an afterlife and spirituality, and that really helped. And then, so I was in hospice for many years doing patient care and witnessing this. And then I went away from the bedside to work in quality and education and regulatory, and started feeling that death anxiety creeping up in me again. And then I got on TikTok and started talking about it with people. And I think what it was is, even though I was still and am still in the death industry, and I'm teaching about death and dying to my colleagues, it's not like a huge focus of my job. I do chart audits and I participate in complex case reviews and we do performance improvement projects. But as I started to talk about it on TikTok all the time, like posting 3 times a day about death and dying, and also becoming aware that this is death anxiety is a thing. Like people have this, a lot of people have this, and people are saying to me, wow, I'm not afraid anymore after watching your videos. And I started to feel like, wow, that death anxiety in me that had started creeping up just went back down again. And so I felt like, oh, it's because of this acceptance of death. Like once we can get to a place where we accept that we are going to die, it just sucks the power out of it. It's like, yeah, it's going to happen. I can't do anything about that. Now I'm going to live my life. And when it happens because it's out of my control. When you can get to that place of just being like, it is what it is. I can't do anything about it. Then you are free to live your life more fully because you're not just constantly perseverating on what happens if I die, and.
That's what I was gonna say. I think it actually it's freeing. I think what people are so fearful of death, and I'm like, actually, no, when you face it, it's freeing. Like you really can live more boldly in a big life.
I live in like love liberates, right? And I think that when you can see anything through a loving lens, right, and hold it and honor it and more so walk with it, that's when like, yeah, then you can be out here in the world, right, and not stuck in, right, like a worry, right? Because I mean, essentially that's what like any kind of anxiety is. It comes from a place of worry and fear.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. Yeah, definitely
And
fear-based.
you can, I mean, in as big as death or as little as like, what are you having for lunch? Like food anxiety. Like I have that. Like I'm like, I can't, I often like, and because of years of, you know, unhealthy eating habits, like I often choose not to eat because I have so much anxiety about trying to figure out what to eat, right? And that's like just something that I continuously have to face head on. I'm like, no, wait a minute. I nourish your body. Like whatever it is, nourish it. Take it, and so yeah, it feels daunting, I think, for a lot of people to think about death in that way. And the only way we're going to get there is by having that conversation.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And saying the D word.
The D word. Um, a lot of your book is, you mentioned your first husband, you mentioned not starting nursing or going to nursing until you're 40. And so much of your book is also just, your personal story, right? Like it's not just about your hospice nurse experience. And one thing we talk about on this podcast, and we have quite a few episodes on like other types of loss. Divorce is a type of loss, right? Like, so you talk about your sobriety journey, and I have a lot of sober friends that they talk about like kind of the before and after and how that's a type, even though most people have a positive experience in their sobriety, it's like you're shedding a former self, right? And that's a type of loss, right? So maybe talk to us a little bit, whether it's your sobriety, going through divorce, about like, your thoughts around like loss of former selves. Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, I mean, grief is grief, and you have grief over loss, whether it's the loss through a death or a divorce, or even just looking back over your life. And everything changes as you get older, and we face loss all the time, and we just have to kind of um, feel our feels. Kind of corny to say, but you just have to live with it sometimes and sit with it and be in the moment and experience it, and whatever the loss is. But I don't know that I feel like my former divorces were loss for me. I was okay with both.
You're like, bye.
But so, it's part of loss is a part of life. Like what I had to have a hysterectomy when I was 38 years old, and I was done having kids anyway. I had 3 kids already, but even now at 62, there are times when I feel like, oh, I can never have another baby again. It just comes up every now and then, and it's a part of life, that things change, and that, we could be beating ourselves up for feeling that way, or we can just go, yeah, that makes me sad, and I'm going to feel that sadness, and then I'm going to get on with my day. We just learn to live with our losses is what happens, and we never truly stop grieving our losses. Some of them we can. you know I'm not sorry about, my car that I wrecked when I was younger, that type of thing you can move on from. But significant loss that we experience, we never stop grieving. We just learn to live with it. And I think that's important, because people will be like, oh, it's time to move on. Your person died 2 years ago and it's time to move on. And you never really move on. You just learn to live with that. I guess you move on in a way, but it's not like you're going to just shelve that, never think about it anymore. You're still going to have it bubble up in the surface every now and then and go, oh, that really makes me sad,
You
still
say
after
you
all
move
these years.
forward with it, like
Yeah.
because you carry it with you. It doesn't just like go away, right? I mean, we'll have to talk. I'm going to email you after because, and Alyce, I haven't even told you this. I am very likely going to also have to have a hysterectomy. I've never had kids. We've chosen not to have kids. I've had some like abnormal stuff come back, and my doctor was like, let's just take this thing out so you don't have to worry about long story. But I have been anticipating grief. I'm like, I bet I'm going to have some feelings around this,
Yeah, I bet
so
you
we'll
are
have to
too.
talk. I
Yeah.
know. And I'm
Even though you've made
kind
the
of,
decision to not have kids, it's still a part of you that's being taken away, and you didn't make that decision. That was just taken from you. And I mean, like, I'm 62. I wouldn't, even if I still had a uterus, I wouldn't be having more babies. But it's just a
right.
part. It's a
Why
lot. It's
not?
a
I'm just
loss
kidding.
of a part of me. It's a loss of a part of me.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. So
Exactly.
you have
Yeah.
an
So we'll talk.
anticipatory grief about that.
Yeah. Well, I just, exactly. I mean, not yet, but I was like, I bet I'm going to have feel like, as it gets closer to like surgery or so obviously like after too, I'm like, I bet I'm going to be feeling because you're losing a part of it is a part of your body. It's a part of yourself, right? And even though I know I've known that I'm not going to have kids for a long time, I'm like the finality of like, I'm like, well, I can't change my mind after it's gone. So, I mean,
But once you get through that little blurb of grief that you're going to have over that loss, you're going to be like, "Damn, this is the best thing I ever did." Trust me.
okay, good. Okay, good. I'm excited. I'm excited to know that.
Trust me.
Okay, yeah.
Everybody I know, every woman I know, it's like,
Yeah, I've talked to a couple women that have had them and they've been said same thing. They're like, it's like the best. So
yes,
I'm glad to
yeah. Let's
hear
talk
that.
about anticipatory grief, though, since we did. I
Yeah,
did
yeah,
just,
yeah.
you know, uh, one of my favorite things is that anticipatory grief is like being forced to watch a whole movie when you know the ending is bad. And when your person is dying, the movie is that they're dying and the ending is their death. And so many people, when their person is like lingering and they're kind of waiting for them to die and they're like, when is this going to happen? They start to really experience this anticipatory grief. Like they know this is going to happen. When is it going to happen? Will it be over soon? And that really turns into very complicated grief, because now they're kind of wishing their person would just hurry up and die in a way. That's not what they're thinking, but that's what it ends up kind of feeling like. And then when their person dies, then they're like, oh my gosh, I just wished their life away. I wish I wouldn't have done that. And so it's very complicated grief, that anticipatory grief, that waiting and then having the relief when it's over. And I think that's where sayings like, at least they're not in pain anymore, at least they're not suffering anymore, I think that is what drives those kinds of, um, you know, feelings or perspectives, is because otherwise we have to say it's a relief to me that they're gone, they're not here anymore, because I was suffering waiting for them to die.
I mean, it's just like I even in the 4 days, right? Like I distinctly remember saying to my sister, I can't leave here not knowing if it's the last time I'm going to see mom. And I was like, because she was like, hospice said it could be months, it could be weeks. Like, and I was like, no.
I'm surprised that they told you that to me, I'm like, I don't want to second guess the providers, but first of all, why didn't they tap her? That didn't make sense to me that they wouldn't tap. If she had ascites, they can drain that fluid off regardless of the cause of it. Yes, it will come back, but it's going to make her more comfortable. And also, we can put a drain in that the family can drain that at home too. So that's puzzling to me. But the fact that she had this quick diagnosis and sudden decline, it seems like a little odd to me. That I hate to, hindsight is 2020. I hate to second guess people, but I'm curious as to why they didn't see that happening as quickly as it did.
Yeah, I have no idea. I mean, I've often thought about that, especially like in reading your book, like, and I've had to come up with like kind of my own. I mean, I guess I should have like researched. There was something that in your book that you
Oh,
Googled.
grief, and how
Um,
come we were pooping and peeing so much when we were grieving my dad's death?
yes, the stress. And it's so funny because when I was separating my first husband, literally everything I ate went straight through me. And I lost like 20 pounds in like a month. And it's just like I didn't change anything in my diet, but I was like, what is happening to me? And it was like that. And
Yeah, stress hormones.
it was. And I did not experience that with my mom. I don't know. I honestly am like I it's a blur. Those months after, it was July, a week 2 weeks later was my sister and I's birthday. It was the height of the pandemic. Her younger sister had been diagnosed, my mom's younger sister was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer the August prior to all of this happening. My mom had been in New Orleans because she had had the Whipple procedure and was going through chemo and radiation, had come home, and I guess it was March, and then the pandemic really hit, and all this started. She started, like, became stationary. She was walking 20,000 miles and then stopped because she said it was too hot
That's
outside.
a that's a lot of trips back and
I was
forth
like, wow,
across the
that is
country.
amazing.
Yeah, 20,000 steps. Sorry, did I say miles?
I was like, wow, that's amazing. I'm just kidding.
She would
I'm
walk
just
in
kidding.
heaven.
Oh.
Um, yeah, and so it just like, but like even in that moment of those 4 days, I was like, I cannot do this. And so when she did die, I was like, I definitely had a moment of like, oh my God, did I wish mom to die? Right? Because it was so, yeah. And
It's a
then
relief. It's a relief.
it was because I was just like, I can't. And so that made me think about like when it came to the medicine, like it didn't, she had the death rattle. And also in reading, like, oh, we could have moved her, we could have changed her position, and thankfully, at the in nights when it got really challenging, I was like death can't be painful. Like, why? Like, that was my question, is like, why would God make this painful? And then I was like, well, was the medicine really for to comfort her, or was it to like soften the like our experience of death?
Well, the pain medicine would be for her, and the medication for the secretions is for the family, and it doesn't work very well at all. And death isn't painful, but cancer is painful. Death from cancer is painful. Death, I've had patients who died that never experienced any suffering, that didn't need any morphine at the end. They died of dementia and they didn't have any pain. But there are diseases that can cause pain.
That
Yeah.
cause pain. And that was something I really, is like just in the last week or two of reading your book, that like, oh, we like, no, right, yes, okay, so my instinct of death not being painful is correct, correct.
Like our bodies know how to die, right? Like
They know how to die, just like we know how to
be
to be
born.
birthed.
Exactly.
Like how we know how to push life through our
Exactly.
bodies. We have that like internal instinct. I work and practice a lot in movement practices, and it's like one of the things is the body is innately intelligent, right? We have to drop out of thinking and trust our bodies. in everything that we do. Um and it was just, my own, that experience of not truly having a hospice guide was like left a lot of wondering, I feel like, for my family and I. But also not our full experience. Like we've worked with hospice a lot in our lives, unfortunately, whether it was grandparents, all of my mom's brother and three sisters passed away from cancer prior, well, excuse me, her brother and older sister passed away from cancer. So we were all a part of that. Um, they've lost various uncles, aunts throughout the lifetime, and I guess it just didn't really hit home until that experience for me of being with my mom. I would love to talk about um, the difference between like natural death, right? And you talk about it in your
Mm-hmm.
book, and
Natural
um, yeah,
natural death and
you know where
natural
I'm.
birth, or natural death and not natural death?
Yeah, natural death and not natural death. I reckon in natural death and natural birth. Sure, yes, all of it.
Yeah. Well, the big difference between natural birth and natural death is that women who choose to do natural birth don't have any kind of pain medications on board. And natural death, you can have pain medications. A natural death means that somebody is dying from natural causes. Usually, we've had some that on hospice that weren't dying of natural causes. They hit a deer or whatever, and they were put on life support. Actually, there's still kind of a natural death because they're taken off of life support and they're allowed to die naturally. So that's what a natural death means, is that a person is dying naturally from whatever their disease is, or if it was a traumatic injury and they are not put on life support or they're taken off of life support, they're allowed to die naturally. There's no medical intervention that's prolonging their life. They're just getting comfort focused care, and the body is being allowed to die naturally and go through a dying process, which can take a while. It can take months. I mean, we're all dying. That's what getting old is. But when somebody's actually like really terminally ill and getting close to the end of their life, that dying process can take months, slow over time, or it can be really quick. And sometimes people can die very quickly. But that a natural death just means that there's no prolonging interventions that are happening. We're not intubating them. Um, Sometimes we're going to do tube feeding, but until that tube feeding is stopped, they're not really completely in the dying process yet. We're not keeping them alive by artificial means. We're just allowing a natural death.
Interesting. That's so fascinating.
There's even a AND, DNR AND, do not resuscitate, allow natural death.
Oh, I need to update my will. I need to update all my health directives and stuff. Um, I was just thinking as we were just talking this past like 5, 10 minutes, when you were talking about, and I know we need to wrap up soon, and Alyce wants to read something from the end of your book, which we love. Do you have, when we were talking about anticipatory grief, do you have recommendations for the family and loved ones? Because I'm sure you've watched so many times that like anticipating someone to die and then you feel guilty, and it's like, not to be like, what are some best practices and tips? That's not what I mean, but like, have you seen things that help people deal with that anticipatory grief?
Well, again, being open about talking with everyone that's involved about what is happening, so that you're not going to have this regret later that you didn't have these conversations. If you're having these conversations with that person, that helps to kind of stop that anticipatory grief. But also lean on the hospice chaplain. Not enough people utilize the hospice chaplain, and they're amazing. It's not necessarily about religion if you don't want it to be. It's not necessarily about spirituality, but they can definitely lift your spirits, and they're great listeners, and they're really they have a master's degree in divinity, and they're able to like reflect back things and listen, and they're a wonderful resource, but it's very underutilized. People don't like to get the chaplain involved unless they're religious, because so many people think that the chaplain is all about religion and they're going to try to convert me, and that is not the case. There are atheist chaplains, it's really not about religion, but definitely I think leaning on really all members of the care team, but especially when it comes to like the psychosocial, emotional, spiritual stuff, the social worker and the chaplain are really helpful. And then asking lots of questions too, and making sure that you understand what is happening with that person as time goes on. Um, I always just used to say to people, lingering does not equal suffering. If that person is comfortable, then death takes as long as it takes. And we don't know what is going on in here. They're processing the end of their life. They're doing life review. We don't know, so.
Those are good. Those are good recommendations. That reminds me of a story. When so my father died 7 years ago. His name was Jim, which is a pretty common name, but my maiden name starts with an R. So Jim Rozier. And so when my grandmother died in 2022, we were in the room with her, and the chaplain that came in, his name was Jim R. And we were like it didn't say just Jim, it said Jim R. And I was like, what? This is so crazy. So I just thought it was weird. I know we need to wrap soon. Alyce, I know you wanted to read something from the end of the book.
Yeah. I think too, it's like before I read this last little paragraph, um, it's like I think it all revolves down to coming to a space of acceptance. Um, is like just this common theme that like when we are able to accept our mortality, right? Like it allows us to love and live more fully in the moment, and almost like it's like in its grace for our own lives, like um our like own, it's like call it a mistake, but it's like also a mistake that has informed my life. Some people might see it as, it's like you said, I didn't mourn my, Penny, you didn't mourn your divorces, right? Those were the best things for you. Where it's like, from someone else's perspective, it's like, oh, it's like, oh, when I went through my divorce, and I come from a Catholic family, my mom was like, you don't have to say it out loud. Like, okay, well, it's not happening to me. It's just the state, right? Like, it's just like, I made the choice. We're not going to be married anymore. Like, and it's nothing, like, it doesn't define who I am. I don't know. So it's and it's like, eventually it's like, oh, this acceptance around almost like frees up the space to be
Yeah.
throughout life.
You don't have to like it, but you do have to accept it at some point because it's inevitable.
Yeah.
And not accepting it doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
Well, I feel like it only causes additional suffering. Like you're causing yourself to suffer more by not accepting, So yeah.
Absolutely. People that don't accept their death will get terminal agitation. We see it all the time, that people get very agitated towards the end of their life if they haven't come to terms with the fact that they're dying. And most people do get there. Most people at the end, they do get there. They get there with acceptance. But those who aren't willing to get to that point, it's hard. They get terminal agitation. I follow someone.
They're like literally fighting.
Yeah, I follow someone on Instagram who is a young woman who's been, I hate to use the terminology battle. I don't like battle language when it comes to treating cancer, but she's been, in her own words, battling cancer for probably 5 years, and she's in her 30s. And what she is putting herself through is, I mean, truly, she's a warrior in what she's doing, but also I question if she's going to have a good death at the time when death comes for her, because she has resisted. She's got Mets to her brain, Mets to her bones. She's having pathological fractures, broke her leg, can't see out of one eye anymore. I mean, she's just falling apart and continuing to do aggressive treatments and forcing herself to get up and walk and heal that bone and do occupational therapy and physical therapy. And I'm just like, when the time comes, when finally some doctor is going to say, and some have been saying, we're not going to do this anymore. And then she goes and finds another doctor who will. And at some point, when everybody says no, I have a feeling she's going to have some serious terminal agitation, because she has just been fighting and fighting the whole way. And will not accept that this is going to be the end. And on one hand, I can't blame her. She's got young children. She wants to see her children grow up as long as she possibly can. But on the other hand, there does come a time when you have to go, you know what? It is what it is, and I can't control it. And she might. She might be the type of person that when that time comes, she will just go, you know what? I'm done. I've done everything that I possibly could, and now I'm done. So it's hard to say, but I do know from experience that younger people who don't want to die and not necessarily don't want to, because who wants to, right? But don't accept that they are going to inevitably and that nothing can be done about that, have a harder time, and they do get more agitated. Like my lady who I bathed with her daughters. She was on multiple infusions. She was on all kinds of heavy drugs to sedate her because she was so agitated.
And it's like, at what point, in circumstances like that, are you really living? Right? Like, and
everything you eat makes you throw up. You can't
yeah,
really go anywhere anymore. And
yeah,
it's not life. It's not quality of life, but everybody has the right to determine what quality means to them. Because
absolutely.
quality of life is what the person who's living that life says it is.
Can we finish with this last little quote?
Yes.
We can cut this too, but it is the very last paragraph of your chapter. Is that okay if I read it?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
Spoiler
alert.
Spoiler alert if you don't want it. You say, I guess the moral of the story is most of us don't want to feel like our time on earth wasn't well spent, whether there's an afterlife or not. I hope my legacy is the lesson that letting go of your fear of death can help you to embrace each day with grace and gratitude, and convene you to have a fucking blast while you have the chance. Or have the chance. Yeah.
Yes.
And I love that. It's just like the summary of living life to its fullest. And I think that's something Crystal and I are really connected on in our own experiences of loss, that how that loss has really informed how we're living full on in our lives, chasing our dreams, connecting, and the joy that talking about death has really created a freedom. And you've been speaking about, this is what I say, right? Like, something that's really important to me is like changing the language in which we use when we're not only talking about our own experiences, but when we're being empathetic to other people's experiences, so that when we are in our own literally dying experience, right, that there's still, for me, there's a freedom and a joy and a lightness and a love and a gratitude.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you, Penny.
Yes, thank you for being here. And let's see the book. Let's see it. Influencing Death.
When can we
There
get
it
it? When
is.
can we get our copies?
So it's available for pre-order now, and it'll be released on January 14th. And it's anywhere books are sold online. So Amazon, Tertulio, Barnes & Noble, the Audible for the audio version that I narrated. It's an ebook, paperback, hardback.
Oh, love that. Yes, we've already pre-ordered our copies. Even though we've read it, I'm like, I can't wait to have it physically in my hands. And everybody can find you at Hospice Nurse Penny on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all the socials.
Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, all the socials. Yeah. And then I have the Death Happens podcast, Death Happens, an Insider's Guide to Dying, that I do with a hospice social worker. So that's kind of a nice combination of information that we are putting out there about hospice and death and dying. And I also have a website, hospicenursepenny.com.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, thank you again for your time. This has been so fun, so enjoyable. And then we'll be chatting soon.
Thank you for joining the Morning Call podcast. Our intention is that you found a nugget of hope, inspiration, connection, or all of the above.
If you seek to dive deeper with the Morning Call community, email us, subscribe to our page, leave a review, and fill out our survey.
We want to hear your stories and widen the conversation to support and empower our grief experiences as we collectively become our true selves.
Find us and subscribe on all streaming platforms, YouTube, and at Morning Call Podcast on Instagram. You can also email us at morningcallpodcast@gmail.com.
This podcast was edited by Alexis Carrasquillo from Familia Creative Media.